self-concept, which we're kind of talking about a little bit now, but like our concepts of ourselves are based on all of these strange layers that have happened over our life. And you said something, you kind of briefly went over it earlier, but it was a great statement, is that our identities are some of our actions, right? And experiences.
Yeah, our identities are the aggregation of our emotions over time, and or our experiences over time. I mean, it's more complicated than that. The short version is like, we go through life, we have experiences. To each experience, we have an emotional reaction. To the emotional reaction, we write a narrative explaining, justifying that emotional reaction. And then our identity is kind of our collection of our narratives.
Sounds like a mess.
It is a mess. We're all a mess.
We're all a mess.
We're all a total mess.
And the emotions that we have when we are children are kind of processed differently than when we're older.
Yes.
And so to really sometimes understand who we are, is it important to kind of go back and try to...
For some people, it can be.
Okay.
Especially if there's like some ugly stuff back there. Because it helps with self-acceptance for a lot of people. One way to think about it is, so all these narratives, we have all these experiences, and then we kind of create narratives for those experiences. I describe it as like a ball of yarn. You know, when you're young, your ball's really small. You haven't had many experiences. So if let's say you had a traumatic experience when you're like 3 years old, well, your 3-year-old thinking brain is really underdeveloped. So the only narrative it knows how to create is like, I'm a bad boy, like nobody loves me. And so that becomes like one of the core narratives inside the ball of yarn. And then as your life goes on, your ball expands and expands. So you have all these narratives on top of it that are very much based on that original narrative. Right. And so to get back to that original narrative, sometimes you have to like peel back all these other narratives that you've told yourself, that you've used to justify your self-loathing and your self-hatred for years. And then finally you get back to that core experience. And at least recognizing that it's there, I think is liberating for a lot of people, but it doesn't answer the question of what do you do different. And I think that gets confused a lot too. Like those are two very different processes. One is self-understanding, like why do I feel this way? Why do I act this way? And that does have value, but it doesn't necessarily solve the what do I do question.
Right, because what you do is ultimately, it's the same thing. You have to take action.
Yes.
To change,
yes.
to grow. And you can understand it all you want, but if you don't take the action...
You don't change the ball of yarn.
Yeah, you don't change the ball of yarn. You know, we've talked about trauma on this show quite a lot. I've had a really good guy on named Dr. Gabor Mate who talks about trauma. And he said something that kind of surprised me. I'm curious what you think, but he said, you know, trauma isn't what happens to you, it's the fact that you didn't process that.
Yes.
And I always thought that was interesting. So it's like, okay, you got sexually abused when you were a kid and you didn't tell anybody.
Yeah.
So it got kind of encapsulated, and like you said, you created some narrative in your head of I'm a bad boy or something, and it got locked in time and you never got to actually do it. Whereas maybe if you got to like talk about it and blah, 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 it wouldn't necessarily become trauma.
Well, because when you talk about it, you create a better narrative.
Right.
Talking about it helps you, like what processing is actually coming up with a narrative that's closer to reality, which is like, you didn't deserve it, you were a victim, you know, life's not fair, it's not your fault, you know, all those types of things. Like that's a healthy kind of narrative to justify that experience. Not justify, but like explain that experience.
Yeah.
So if you don't get that help in creating that narrative, then you create the unhealthy narrative, which is like, you know, I deserved it or whatever. And then that follows you for your whole life until you go back and rewrite that narrative.
Okay, so you think it's important that people should just know that that's the case, just to understand themselves, necessarily go back and peel all those layers off or not?
Necessary, no, but it helps. Okay. It helps. But there's a trap. Sometimes people get obsessed with going back and playing with their ball of yarn, you know, and that's just, at a certain point it becomes navel gazing. You know, you got to go live.
So my parents got divorced when I was 7, and that always comes up in my ayahuasca experiences. And I think it actually it definitely changed my behavior for the rest of my life,
Yeah.
because I kind of blocked the world out and was like, if you can hurt me, I'm not going to let anyone else hurt me. But then back to Viktor Frankl, I mean, literally, I was in an upper middle class suburban neighborhood where nothing bad happens. My parents never yelled at each other. Like, there's nothing really bad about that. But
Yep.
for me, it was like, I might as well have been in Auschwitz or something. It was
Yeah.
like horrible. And again, I guess that comes back to people. Like, you'll take whatever problem there is and it'll just become your problem.
Especially if you're an angry teenager.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think at that age, we're not equipped well to, like, in our brains, especially at that age, like our brains have not developed enough to have that broad perspective. You know, it's like your parents do feel like tyrants and you do feel oppressed. And it's like that all seems reasonable at that age. And so if you hang on to those narratives, that will go through it. You know, you have to do the work as an adult to kind of reevaluate those things and be like, all right, yeah, I was pretty well off actually.
Yeah, exactly.